Tell me she jumped and she got to scream and pass out. She's like a living addiction. Oh, girl, plug it in. I can't. Look at it. Oh, boy. So here's that open warfare, open land warfare I was talking about. Come on in, you'll see the different styles of fighting. I'll narrate a little bit. This is the guerrilla fighting from inside the wood line. Ambush style tactics. This is what the Continentals were willing to do. The British would march in the open fields. Ambush. You can see how they're dressed. Continentals don't really have a uniform, whereas the British are in a red uniform. Ambush, ambush, ambush. Ambush, ambush, ambush. Guerrilla warfare. Not gorilla. Ooh, guerrilla. Horses, cavalry. They're retreating. The attitude is live to fight another day. All right, here's the open warfare. I'm going to hit some ads.
Are you interested in a
Love ads. Love ads. All right, what you're going to see is the more open battlefield strategy. This is, I think it's insane. Why would you just stand there? But this is the very European style of fighting at the time. You can see they even have their powdered wigs on and their fancy clothes. That's not to say that the Americans, my bad. The Americans would come into the open field and fight like that as well, but the guerrilla warfare tactics is what really turned the tide of the war for them. So that's charging across the battlefield. Now they're using the bayonets. A trained soldier could fire about 3 shots in 1 minute. Oh, look, the Patriots knew about the land. The British walked right into the trap because they did not know about the land. Cannons and mortars. Red is the British. All right, so real quick, I'll explain a little bit what you saw in the movie. I really just wanted you to see the tactics. The red, obviously that was the British. And Mimi had a good observation. I said that the white powder, the white stuff was their wigs. These gentlemen would literally march into battle wearing their fancy clothes with their powdered wigs. And no, it's not their real hair, right? They would wear this wig because it was a gentleman, kind of a status symbol kind of thing. The red was the British. The ragtag guys you saw, that was called the militia. And those were the Minutemen, the guys who would just leave their homes, join the army, bring their own rifle. The Bluecoats was the organized Continental Army. The Americans did raise a regular army who trained in the open battle warfare strategies. So I'm not saying that the British were the only ones who walked in the open battle. You obviously saw that the armies met each other on the field, stood there and fired at each other. but the American strategy to use the guerrilla warfare tactics, the ambush style tactics, you also saw that. That's what really turned the tide of the war. Let me ask you this. Where do you think the Americans learned those guerrilla warfare tactics?
The Indians.
Say it again, Isaac?
The Indians.
The Indians, yeah, the Indian style of fighting. And it was seen as, like I said, it was seen as ungentlemanly. But the Americans said, gentlemen, whatever, let's win the war. And that's why they used the guerrilla warfare tactics.
Wasn't there, I don't know if it was in Vietnam or not, but there was a thing they used guerrilla warfare.
That's exactly right. Vietnam War is another example of guerrilla warfare
They
strategy.
used gas instead.
Yeah, well, technology is going to continue to advance. Absolutely. Abigail?
The Americans, they were more camouflaged than the British.
You're right. The American militia, the guys that wore the kind of the darker brown regular clothes, you're exactly right. The British are marching through the American forests wearing these bright red coats. So it was not camouflaged. Obviously, it was not very tactical in that regard. So that was a big flaw in their thinking. They thought that they were showing off how regal they are, when in fact, all they're doing is making themselves a target. That's exactly right. All right, let's move on. So that very first battle, we did not yet have an organized army. George Washington was not yet the leader of the army. Following that first battle, Lexington and Concord, it's kind of like, all right, game on. Now we need a leader of our army. So George Washington was chosen kind of for all the reasons I already said. He had more experience. He was a motivator. He was someone that was seen that could like raise an army. Being from Virginia instead of Boston, they believed that he could bring in the Southerners into the war, not just Boston, which is in the north, but also the Southerners would be willing to join the fight. So that's why George Washington was chosen. I'm going to point out super briefly here, you don't need to write these names down. We also got some help from overseas. The French and the Prussians, which is kind of modern day Russia, several of their top generals also came over and helped train our army. So Marquis de Lafayette,
Who are the first?
Russia, well, it's kind of like modern day Russia. You know, both borders have changed and country names have changed, but that's basically what Russia is. So George Washington is the American leader. And yes, we also got some foreign help, Marquis de Lafayette, Baron von Steuben. We'll talk more about them next year. Let's talk about the strategies now. That first battle kind of was, I don't want to say it's a mistake, but it kind of just happened. Well, now that we're going to wage a war, we need to have a strategy. So the American strategy is called attrition. Attrition means wear them down. Have you ever attrited your parents when you're just bugging them about something? Mom and Dad, can I go to the party? Mom and Dad, can I go to the party? Can I go to the party? Can I stay out till 11? Can I stay until 11? Can I stay until 11? Can I stay until 11? That's what you're doing, is wearing them down. That's called attrition. So the idea for the Americans was just hang on longer than they're willing to hang on. They have such a long supply line. They have to come over that ocean every single time they bring soldiers or supplies. So they're going to get tired eventually. The British are going to get tired eventually. If the Americans can just hang on longer than the British are willing to hang on, maybe they'll just go away. Maybe they'll just go back home, and that's how we'll win the war. So first strategy was attrition. Second strategy was the guerrilla tactics we've already talked about. And then the third important strategy was to try to make an alliance with one of Britain's enemies. And then the main enemy at that point would be France. So we're really going to try to draw the French into the war. We'll see how that goes for us. British, they also have a strategy. They wanted to break the colonies in half, separate the North from the South, right? If they can't fight together, they're not strong enough to fight as separate regions. So let's try to cut them in half, North versus South, and then to also blockade all the ports. Ports are where supplies can come in, where trade happens. If they're able to block the ports, the Americans won't have a way to do to do trading. And then finally, hard to talk about. Sometimes we assume that everyone in America was for the revolution. That's not the case. There are many people who continue to see themselves as British, wanted to stay loyal to the British crown. Those people are called Loyalists. Those who stayed loyal to the British crown were not a part of the patriot cause. They were called Loyalists. And there's many reasons that someone would want to be loyal. Maybe they were making money from the current relationship, right? Things are good for us. We don't need independence. Maybe they were afraid of being arrested or executed for being a part of the rebellion. So there's a lot of reasons people would stay loyal. And the British thought, if we can use these loyal subjects to try to beat down the patriot cause, maybe we can win the war like that. So both sides has a strategy. More battles yet to come. Let's keep moving on. Next one is called Bunker Hill. You'll see it on your page, Bunker Hill. This is fought just outside of Boston, and Bunker Hill is characterized by it was technically a loss for the Patriots. Okay, they lost the ground. They got kicked off the hill, but you know who lost more people? British. So it was seen as an emotional victory for the Patriots. Even though they lost the hill, okay, and from a military perspective, you always want to keep the hill.
The high ground.
The high ground, yeah. They got kicked off the hill, but they killed so many British along the way that it was seen as an emotional victory for the Patriots. So June 17th, 1775, it was a British victory, but it was very costly for the British. Very high casualties for the British, and that inspired the Americans. So Bunker Hill, jot that down. There's a famous story that comes out of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it is said that the American commander, when he was rallying his troops, he knew that they were very low on ammunition. So my hunter's in the room, right? Whether it's guns or bows and arrows, whatever. Let's say you've only got 3 shots, right? 3 arrows, 3 cartridges, you only got 3 shots. Are you going to take a shot at something that's 500 yards away?
No.
You take a shot at something that's 300 yards away. Maybe.
Maybe.
Are you going to, or if you have the opportunity, are you going to wait until it's so close that you can't miss?
Wait till it's
Wait till it's so close that you can't miss. So the American commander at Bunker Hill, he gives the famous order: do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. So think about it. The white part of my eye. Jackie, open your eyes. About where Jackie is, I can see the white part of her eyes. But a little bit farther than that, I probably couldn't see the white portion of someone's eyes. His statement was, do not fire until they're so close that you can't miss. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And that means, think about it, that means they got really close to each other in the shooting, in the bleeding, in the dying. It was really close and personal. So it was a grisly battle in that regard. Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. So for Bunker Hill, what I want you to do is draw something like an eyeball, right? Whatever that looks like to you. Maybe draw the little red lines if it's a bloodshot eye. Draw eyeball. Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Yes, ma'am. Yes. I'll go back to the words and you can draw an eyeball. Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. This is one of the first organized battles after Lexington and Concord. Lexington and Concord kind of just happened. Oop, the war is on. Bunker Hill was one of the first organized battles where we actually have the armies meeting each other on purpose instead of just the Minutemen being called up. All right, I am going to move on. You can find it on Google Classroom after class. In this same time period, you got your soldiers who are fighting, but you also got your people, your intellectuals who are fighting and writing. Thomas Paine, and I do want you to write down that name, Thomas Paine, under names, is a famous writer who rallied the American cause in print. Not with his gun, but with his pen. So sometimes the fighting wasn't only done by soldiers on the battlefield, it was also done with inspirational writing. Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet called Common Sense, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense becomes something that is shared and printed all around the colonies. Over 100,000 copies printed initially. I think over 1 million copies by the end of the war. He writes some very powerful statements about liberty and freedom, and it's kind of one of those things that just got spread. The message got spread all around the colonies. You today, if a post on Facebook or TikTok or whatever gets spread all around the world, what do we call it? Viral, yeah. Common Sense is a pamphlet that went viral. Well, it leads to the Continental Congress adopting a statement called the Declaration of Independence. Common Sense leads to Congress writing the Declaration of Independence. 3 big names authored the Declaration. If you don't have these written down, you need to. Thomas Jefferson is the main author of the Declaration. He's kind of the whiz kid. He's 33 years old when he writes the Declaration. That is now, I can say, younger than I am. 33 years old, and he writes the Declaration of Independence. So I'm not sure what I've accomplished in my life at age 34. But Thomas Jefferson, at age 33, wrote the Declaration of Independence. He did get help from his mentors, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams. Now, here's a little interesting thought for you. The Declaration of Independence is actually adopted on July 2nd. You might say that it was officially adopted on July 2nd. So why don't we celebrate the 2nd of July? How come we don't have fireworks and barbecues and all that on the 2nd of July? It was signed on the 4th of July. So a lot of people, and the actual date at the top of the document says July 4, 1776. So of course, that's the holiday that we celebrate as our Independence Day. But I do think it's ironic. In fact, John Adams himself, he wrote a letter to his wife, and he said, July 2nd will always be remembered for generations to come as the day that we declared independence. Well, he's close. We definitely celebrate and remember July 4th, just not July 2nd. So always interesting. Next time we roll through July this summer, I want you to think about July 2nd as the day we adopted independence, even though, of course, everybody's going to celebrate on July 4th.
Do we still have the Declaration of Independence?
Yes, sir. It is in Washington, D.C. It's in a building called the National Archives, which is a building that protects a lot of old.
Then why would somebody go there and steal it?
That's right. And if you want to watch National Treasure, you can see Nicolas Cage try to steal the Declaration of Independence.
He stole it.
He did steal it. He did steal it.
He got it.
I mean, not for real, but like in the movie for real.
It's for
All right, now, Declaration of Independence. Let's make a world history connection here. Remember, Thomas Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which sounds a whole lot like John Locke, who wrote Life, Liberty, and Property. And I made the comparison that it might be like plagiarism, or it might be like copying your homework from someone else. But you know what? Just change it up a little, bro. Hey, yeah, you can copy my homework, but just change it up a little. Well, he largely was influenced by John Locke. I wouldn't say that it was plagiarism, but he was largely influenced by John Locke. And yes, there's very similar writings between John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. So we've already talked about that. We've already talked about that a lot. What you got? Question? I'll advance the conversation just a little bit. From the Declaration, we start to write the Constitution. And from the Constitution, we have the Bill of Rights. This is not a government class, so I'm not going to go too much deeper than that. But that is the future of our government. Declaration, Constitution, Bill of Rights. These are foundational American documents that were influenced by the Enlightenment. We've already come through talking about the Enlightenment. All right. Responses to the Declaration. No need to write that down here. Americans were divided. I already said not everybody was for this fight for freedom. Not everybody was for breaking away from the crown. Some people were all about it. Let's go to war. Shoot my guns off in the air. Join the army. Let's fight. Others were very hesitant, very reserved. They didn't know if this could be the end of their families, right? We declared independence. Oh, now the British are going to come and kill everybody around us. A lot of people were really nervous about it. But here is something that was really foundational about the Declaration. No longer were these 13 colonies. They were now referred to as states. We're no longer colonies of the British Empire. We are 13 independent states. So sometimes think about this in your life. You draw the line, you better stick to it, right? They said, we have declared independence. Well, now we have to fight for it. Now we have to fight for that independence, which leads to Washington crossing the Delaware. Have you ever seen this picture before?
Yeah.
Yeah? What's going on here?
I don't know.
So point out one of the key figures in the picture.
George Washington.
There you go, George Washington, crossing the frozen Delaware River. Do you know when?
1767.
Yeah, what day?
Christmas.
Christmas, that's right.
Right.
Christmas night, 1776, when most people would be thinking about celebrating the holiday, right? It's a Christian holiday in a Christian nation.
But Santa Claus.
George Washington says, no rest for the weary. We're going to attack. Because our enemy on the other banks is celebrating, they're drinking, they're partying, we're going to use this opportunity to
What
attack.
about Santa Claus?
So I want you to think that your country is founded by, and one of our major successes in battle happened on Christmas night, 1776. Now, I'll tell you this. This picture is largely inaccurate. It's obviously a painting. It's something that came after the fact.
They said
There's no
Benjamin
photography.
Franklin was there.
Benjamin Franklin was not there, but James Monroe, President James Monroe, is depicted right here. So future President James Monroe, he's in his 20s right here. I think he's like 21 or 22. He is in this picture. Doesn't look quite like that. I want to, so when you write this down, Washington crosses the Delaware, Christmas of 1776. Draw a little Christmas tree, right? So you can associate it with Christmas. This was a much needed victory because we actually hadn't had a big victory yet. Washington's army has suffered defeat after defeat. Now remember, we're just trying to hang on. It's called a war of attrition. We're just trying to wear the British down. But man, we need to start beating them a couple times as well in order to kick them out of our country. This is seen as a large, very much needed and inspirational victory, and it comes on Christmas Eve, Christmas 1776. So, yeah, Christmas of 1776. An inspirational victory, much needed. Washington crosses the Delaware, Christmas of 1776. The picture I just showed you, though, this is what a lot of people think about the crossing of the Delaware. I'm going to show you another one right now. This is probably more accurate at what actually happened. Instead of a round bottom boat, it was likely that they were on flat bottom boats. A flat bottom boat, they would just like push it across the river with poles. It's called poling. And then also you can see how they fit their cannon on there, how they fit hundreds of men on there, probably even some animals, right? Some horses that they would need to get across the river. And it's the flat bottom boat that makes this picture much more accurate. They were not in a round bottom boat. I love the posture of George Washington there, right? He's resolute. He's looking forward. He's watching for any enemy on the banks across the river.
I know that.
He's leading his men in battle. Maybe they had torches like that, but of course you'd also want to keep the light to a minimum so that you could sneak up on your enemy. George Washington, before this attack, he wrote a letter that was read to the whole army. And he signed off with this statement right here: victory or death. He's saying, boys, we may die out there, but we're gonna fight to the end, right? Victory or death. Pretty powerful statement. Showed how resolved he was to actually win the war, victory or death. Now, crossing the Delaware, that's part of the battle. And then the battle that actually happens is in Trenton, New Jersey, called the Battle of Trenton. Painting here shows the enemy just dying in droves. The enemy, believe it or not, actually wasn't British soldiers. It was hired soldiers from Germany. They were called Hessians. These Hessians were called mercenaries, meaning they would fight for anyone who paid them. So they didn't really care about the cause of the Americans. They didn't really care about the British Empire. They were just going to fight for anyone who paid them. And, well, they paid with their lives on this night because George Washington crossed the river and just gunned them all down, killed them all. So big victory at the Battle of Trenton. Major inspirational victory for the Continental Army. All right, so you got a couple notes there. Moving on to the Battle of Saratoga. I know we got 3 more battles. I'm going to go as fast as I can. You know Sarah? What happened? Who's Sarah?
My ex-girlfriend.
Saratoga is a town in New York. This is a very strategic victory, and the reason there's an arrow on the screen is because it's called the turning point of the war. So you can go ahead and draw an arrow on Saratoga. It's the turning point of the war. It's actually 2 battles, right? September and October. So not just one day of a battle. It was 2 separate battles. They both happened at Saratoga. The first battle was kind of like a 50-50 split. The second battle is a decisive American victory. The reason this is a turning point in the war is because after the Battle of Saratoga, where the Americans won, the French were now convinced to join the war. You see, the French had been wanting to join the war, but they weren't quite sure if the Americans were for real, right? They didn't want to join the war if the Americans were going to be the losers. But once the Americans win decisively at the Battle of Saratoga, the French say, we will now support you. You have proven that you're a real army. You have proven that you can take on the British army. So since you have demonstrated your skill at the Battle of Saratoga, we will now join you. Remember what one of our big strategy points was? What was it? to get one of Britain's enemies to join us in an alliance. So this is a major part of our strategy. We now have the French on our side. Now, they wouldn't be able to be on the battlefield immediately. They are over here, and they got to come across the ocean. But the French are going to show up right on time, and I'm going to tell you about that in a couple more steps. So earning the loyalty of the French, getting a treaty with the French, very, very significant. That makes Saratoga the turning point of the war. When you get into U.S. history, we're going to talk about turning points in pretty much every war. Turning point doesn't mean the war is over, but it means that the tide has turned, or we've tilted the scales towards victory. There's still fighting to be done. There's still men who are going to die throughout the war. But the tides have turned towards victory, eventual victory, in this case for the Americans. So that is what the turning point of the war is. See a couple of you still writing, so I'll take a breath for a second. Because I need to. All right, we'll move on so we can get to the finish here. I'm going to skip past this. I thought I hit that slide. All right, next battle, Valley Forge. Valley Forge is the winter of 1777. What you got? All out.
That's a board.
Just take my fast. Take my fast. Come back. Valley Forge, winter of 1777. Valley Forge is in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a northern state, so what are winters like in the north?
Cold.
Yeah, cold. Valley Forge is characterized as being a very brutal winter for George Washington and his troops. But what's remarkable about it is, as hard as the winter was, they used their time to train. And when the winter was over, they were actually stronger than ever before. See, armies didn't fight through the winter in times like this. When it got cold, they don't really have indoor facilities, right? I mean, both armies, it's not like they really came to an agreement. It was just the normal thing to do. Both armies went into the garrison for the winter. So the British, they're in their space for the winter. The Americans, they go to Valley Forge. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be an easy winter. It's going to be a very hard winter. They don't have indoor facilities. They don't have heat. In fact, some of them don't even have adequate clothing, much less even shoes. A lot of men made it through this winter with bleeding, cracked, calloused, bare feet. They literally didn't even have shoes to put on their feet. But amidst the difficulty, I'll go ahead and put some words on the screen here. Amidst the difficulty, amidst many men dying, over 2,000 men died of disease, not of battle, but of disease during this winter. They trained during this time period. And this is when Washington's army became a professional army. They went from a ragtag group of volunteer soldiers who maybe didn't really know what they were getting into, didn't have enough equipment, and they still didn't have enough equipment. But during this winter, they trained really hard. They became more professional, and they emerged in the spring as a powerful fighting force, a force inspired and ready to go back to battle and actually finish the fight with the British. So for your little symbol here, go ahead and put a snowflake. Put a snowflake because it represents a hard winter. Valley Forge is in Pennsylvania. You can go and visit it today. It's one of those museum sites that's been preserved, and you can go and visit it and learn about the history. I haven't been there myself, but I think it'd be a really cool place to visit. Obviously really important to the American Revolution at that time. Really also highlights, as some of y'all are writing, I'll tell you a little more story here, highlights the leadership of George Washington. In a time where most generals would leave their soldiers at their camp and they would go home for the winter, like it would have been normal for George Washington to go home to Virginia, go home to his wife, be inside of his house, and when the winter was over, he just kind of rejoined his troops. That was normal. That was the privilege of gentlemen at the time. George Washington didn't do that. He stayed at Valley Forge. He trained alongside his men. He suffered the cold with them. And because of that, that's one of his big leadership characteristics. He was seen as being amongst his men. He was inspirational to them. He earned their trust. And that was one of the big reasons that they followed George Washington into battle and, of course, eventually winning the war. This is a painting that comes from, inspired by the winter at Valley Forge. This is called the Prayer of George Washington. Now, did this moment actually happen where George Washington is on his knees, he's praying, the sun is glistening down on him. I mean, do you think this moment itself actually happened? We'll never know. It's not like it was a photograph, but we do know George Washington was a man of faith. We do know he read his Bible regularly. He prayed in his journals. He very often spoke of the providence of the Lord and God's will. So we do know he's a Christian man. It's very reasonable to think that he would have prayed for his troops during the hard winter of Valley Forge. Maybe not perfect and picturesque like this picture, but I do believe George Washington prayed for his troops, and I do believe that God was on their side, and that's why we have a country that we have today. So that is Valley Forge. All right, one more. The Battle of Yorktown, and then we'll have a conclusion. Battle of Yorktown. Well, if it's the last battle we're talking about, we're probably talking about the surrender of the British. That's exactly right. So the picture you see here, this is George Washington receiving the surrender of the British Army. And now, since I told you it's the surrender, I'm going to tell you the whole story. What happened was it was a siege of the city of Yorktown. What is a siege? Have we talked about that yet? Say it again, CJ? That's exactly right, a siege. And we're going to talk about a lot of sieges as we get into other wars, finishing out world history and then rolling into U.S. history. A siege is when an army surrounds a city.
I know what's tied to the Ukraine.
They would have tried to do that in the capital city of Kyiv, but they actually got kicked out of Kyiv, which is a pretty cool story that I need to tell you guys. A siege is when an army surrounds a city. They don't necessarily invade that city. They don't go in and bomb that city. They just surround that city, and they don't let anyone in. They don't let anyone out. And eventually, what is that city going to run out of? Food, water, ammunition, and just supplies in general. That's exactly right, CJ. So the point is to try to choke them out to the point that they have to surrender. Well, the city of Yorktown, which is in Virginia, was sieged from September to October 1781. The British commander is Lord Cornwallis. Doesn't that sound like a real fancy title? Lord Cornwallis. So General Lord Cornwallis, he is seen as a very good British general, but he does lose this particular battle. He eventually surrenders. He is forced to surrender to the Continental Army, and that means that America wins the war. So what I want you to draw on this one is a white flag of surrender, much like the surrender squirrel there. Draw a white flag of surrender and just a white flag of surrender. So as you're doing that, it's a real simple sketch. Obviously, the white flag is the international symbol for I surrender, don't shoot. White flag of surrender. This painting right here, I want to tell you a little bit more about it. This painting is actually in the United States Capitol, and it is larger than life size. These figures, like I'm 6 feet tall, right? I'm the size of a man. These figures are like 10 feet tall. Okay, so the painting is larger than life size. It hangs in the United States Capitol, and obviously it shows the British surrendering to George Washington. But you know who is that not? That is not Lord Cornwallis. This is Lord Cornwallis's second in command. Lord Cornwallis was so ashamed that he had lost. He was so ashamed that he had to surrender that he himself did not come out to surrender. He sent his second in command to surrender to George Washington. So that's like, in hindsight, that's almost like the double shame, right? He wasn't even man enough to come out and admit that he lost and surrender his sword, all that kind of stuff. So now I want today, how do we deal with the British today? What's our relationship with the British today? We're friends. We're allies. That's right. And we're going to get into World War I, World War II. We're going to see that we're friends to this day. So as such, the British, very often, when they would come to the United States Capitol, their dignitaries will visit, all that kind of stuff. I just always wonder what they think about when they walk through the Capitol and they see this picture. If you're British and you see this picture, what is it that you have to think of? The time that you lost. Yeah, you have to think about the time that you lost. Now, as world history has played out, it's been beneficial to the whole world. But at the time, obviously, the British, they took the L. They took the L. One more key aspect of the Battle of Yorktown is that this is when the French arrive. The French Navy leaves France, sails across the ocean, lands in Virginia at exactly the right time, and they contribute to the siege by cutting off what avenue of escape?
The ocean, the water.
That's right. The Americans, I'm going to flip to this real quick. This is Yorktown right here. The Americans had surrounded the land aspect of Yorktown, but the British, reasonably, they could have still escaped by water, right? And they could have repositioned their forces. They could have continued the war. But the French Navy slides in at just the right time and cuts them off from the ocean. So the French arrived right on time. The French were great in the ocean and the Navy. They're also very fierce on the land, hand-to-hand combat. They were good fighters. So we owe our independence to the French becoming a part of the war. And in fact, I want you to write this down. The Battle of Yorktown and the French alliance caused the French to go into great debt. They participated in the war, and it cost them a lot of money. That's actually going to cause them problems later on down the line because they are literally in debt because they participated in the American Revolution. We didn't necessarily pay them back financially, and that's going to lead to problems in France itself. So sometimes when you loan your money out to a friend, maybe you shouldn't expect to get it back, right? When you give money to a friend, you should just consider that it's gone, gone forever. October 19th, 1781, this is when Lord Cornwallis officially surrenders, and it is considered the end of the American Revolution. The official treaty that ends the war, this is extra, just pay attention to me, it's called the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And what happens from the Treaty of Paris is this, look at this, I know it's a little bit small, but I think you can get it. This white space, this is formerly the colonies. Well, based on the Treaty of Paris, we now get land all the way up to the Mississippi River. So we didn't just gain independence, we actually gained a lot of land as well. We don't have Florida yet, still belongs to Spain. We'll talk about that in U.S. history. But the colonies go from this skinny little strip of land to all the way to the Mississippi River. Pretty significant that our country grew in that fashion. Here's the big summary. How did we actually win the war? Well, we talked about the strategies. A lot of the strategies actually played out.
Mr. Swanson, can I see Fallon Patterson for a minute?
On her way in the office. Yeah, cool. Good talk. Home field advantage, right? They had the reason to fight for their own land. Knowledge of the terrain. I think those two kind of fit together. They knew every nook, cranny, valley, trail, water path, cave, etc. So the home field advantage, the knowledge of the terrain, and the motivation for the cause. The Americans wanted freedom. If you're a British soldier, you're 22 years old, you get sent from Britain to these colonies, what are you really fighting for?
The life.
You're fighting for your life, but do you really care about these American colonies? You probably don't. You're going because you got told to go. Maybe you're just like a rough and tumble guy and you just want to fight for some reason. But you really don't have a cause to fight for. Whereas the Americans, the colonists, did have a cause to fight for. Make that comparison one more time. Russia and Ukraine. The Russians, many Russian soldiers are texting and tweeting and like sending messages back to their families. They don't want to be in Ukraine. Now they're going because their government told them to, and in a lot of ways they could be punished, maybe even killed if they rebel. But a lot of Russian soldiers don't necessarily want to be in Ukraine, whereas the Ukrainians, what do they have to fight for? Everything. Yeah, their life. So motivation for the cause, civilian support. A lot of Americans, were able to, a lot of homes in the colonies were for the patriot cause. The British, if they went up to a home, knock, 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 they might catch a bullet in their face. But hey, the Patriots, hey, we really need some food tonight. Can you help us out? They had the civilian support. Great leadership, where I talked about George Washington a lot. And then, very importantly, that alliance, mostly from France, a little bit from Spain in the end as well. So those foreign alliances were really important.
It was mostly because the Patriots would ask them if they could use their help.
Yeah, versus demanding. Caesar makes a great point. The patriot cause, they were kind of brothers. They were kinship versus the British. No, let me have your food. Right? That wasn't really endearing to anyone. So rounding it out here, guys, the end result is that the United States wins, becomes an independent nation. But now what? But now what is you got to pay attention to U.S. history for the rest of next year. Will the U.S. survive? Stay tuned to find out. right? Will the U.S. survive? Stay tuned to find out. You got to take U.S. history. You got to take U.S. history next semester to find out about that. Now, I see some of y'all writing in the result box. That's fine, right? The United States becomes an independent nation. Leave a little bit of space because I got 2 more nuggets for you, okay? Here's a little bit more about the result. This is the world history perspective, okay? We won't repeat this next year. This is the world history perspective. From the American Revolution, there's an increase in nationalism around the world. Very many territories were under empire status at that time. The British Empire, based off of the Age of Discovery, claiming lands all around the world, the British Empire extended very, very, very far, even though England itself was only a small country. Same is true in Latin America. There was a lot of conquest in Latin America. Spain, Portugal owned a lot of territories in South America, Latin America. Well, a lot of other countries and people around the world saw what happened to the American Revolution, and they said, hey, maybe we can break free too. We don't want to be under British rule anymore. We don't want to be under Spanish rule anymore. We're going to fight just like they fought. We're going to take up our arms. We're going to wage war. We have home field advantage too. So there was a lot of other independence movements that happened around the world based on the American Revolution. France is going to have a revolution. We'll talk about it this week. Haiti, Mexico, many in South America. We're not going to talk about those specifically, but you can know that many other revolutions and independence movements were sparked by the American Revolution. I love this phrase right here from Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, he's probably talking about civil rights in America, but he says, no one is free until we're all free. Many other independence movements were inspired by the American Revolution. The French Revolution, just hear me on this. The French Revolution, radical societal change in France. They adopted a motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which means brotherhood. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. Very similar to the American Revolution. They weren't overthrowing a British power necessarily, but there was change inside of France, motivated by the American Revolution and Enlightenment principles. The way the Americans used the Enlightenment ideas to write the Declaration of Independence, the French are going to do the same thing. Here's one more. Simone Bolivar, he is called El Libertador, which means, anyone? The Liberator, that's right. Come on, clicker. The Liberator. So, I don't know if I said that Espanol exactly right, but the Liberator, Simone Bolivar, he's known as the Napoleon of South America. We haven't talked about Napoleon, but I think you probably know he's a military general from France. Simone Bolivar, he is a leader of multiple, not just one, but multiple independence movements throughout Latin America. And he is credited with independence movements in these 5 countries: Venezuela, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia is actually named after him. Simone Bolivar, Bolivia, the country, is named after him. Those countries were breaking free from the Spanish Empire, not the British, but the Spanish. Ironically, the Spanish did help us a little bit. And then, of course, they find themselves in rebellions based off of the American Revolution right there. So move on from that one. Overall, it turns into a party in the USA, right? The rest of American history is still to be written. And I'll tell you, I'll just give you some personal perspective. I have realized the depth of American history more than I ever imagined before. I believe when I came to teaching, I left the active duty Army, I came to teaching. I thought I knew social studies pretty well. I thought I knew U.S. history pretty well. I can teach U.S. history. Man, have I learned along the way. So it's not just the American Revolution. It's not just watch The Patriot and you probably know U.S. history. There is so much U.S. history still to learn. It doesn't stop with this independence movement right here. So I know I've done a lot of talking today, but I hope that you are interested in learning more yourself. You see my U.S. history class bounce around the school, doing different activities. Maybe you're wondering what's going on. It'll be your turn next year, right? You're going to learn U.S. history next year. So this is the big setup to U.S. history. We're going to continue to talk about things in this class that fit into U.S. history as well, like World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and beyond. So this is the time of history where world history and U.S. history really start to collide. And what we're trying to do is set you up to have some facts in your head about U.S. history. When you come to class next year, next semester, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, we've talked about that before. So that's where we're going in the class. I'm going to click play on this, and I'm not sure how far we'll get, but the first half of this show is a really cute rendering of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and it is told by arguably the greatest storyteller of all time, Walt Disney. So I think we'll get through the first half of the episode, and you'll be able to have seen some things. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. It's black and white, a little bit different than you guys watch sometimes, but I think you'll enjoy it.
The Liberty Story.
The Liberty Story. You can pack your notes up. Just sit back and enjoy the show.
The Sons of Liberty. Glowing.